My name is Keisha Moore, and I am the research manager here at Thurgood Marshall Institute, a multidisciplinary social science research center of the Legal Defense Fund. Thurgood Marshall understood that addressing anti-Black racism and creating systemic change requires a multidisciplinary approach. And while LDF is best known for its legal work, the Thurgood Marshall Institute supports LDF's efforts through original research, public education, and non-legal advocacy, as well as by preserving civil rights history in our distinguished archives. We are happy to share with you today a high-level overview of our analysis of Project 2025 that's covered in our recent report, Attack on Our Power and Dignity, what Project 2025 means for Black communities. We will have a brief Q&A at the end of our speaker discussions. And so please feel free to type your questions directly into the Q&A box as you think of them, and we will cover as many as we can at the end of the presentations. So I'd like to begin our discussion with my colleague, Tanya Farrell-Chestnut, LDF's Data and Senior Research Analyst. Hi, Tanya.
Hey, Keisha, thank you so much. It's great to be with everyone and welcome again. So, Keisha, if you don't, I'm going to speak from a social scientist perspective. Can I do that?
Please do. Thank you.
Yeah, so Project 2025, or the Mandate for Leadership, as it is referred to in the plan by the Heritage Foundation, will command and control day-to-day Census Bureau operations. So I just wanted to put a plug in that before we get started, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And can you start with giving us a really general high-level overview of the impact on Black political participation for Project 2025?
Sure. So the idea here is to command and control. How do they do that? How are they proposing that that is accomplished? By politicizing census operations, the largest statistical federal agency, which risks compromising the Bureau's role as a nonpartisan statistical agency responsible for counting the entire U.S. population. There are extreme political motivations behind these efforts because census data is crucial for political representation and the allocation of essential resources. Political appointees will advocate for changes to the types of questions asked and how data is categorized, collected, and processed, making it even harder to capture accurate information about Black, Latinx, and Indigenous populations. So we already recognize that there is mistrust of the government, and it's a significant challenge for the Census Bureau and why people do not participate. So distrust and low participation tend to be highest among groups that have been historically undercounted in previous census. So I just want to sort of wrap this up by also mentioning that the mandate also proposes to consolidate, eliminate, or privatize three of the most important statistical agencies in the federal government: the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Census Bureau, and the Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I would be remiss if I did not share the proposal's plan to add a citizenship question. Adding a citizenship question isn't a brand new idea. In 2018, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce announced his decision to reinstate a citizenship question on the 2020 Census questionnaire. So Political appointees would add a citizenship question to the U.S. Census, discouraging both citizens and non-citizens alike from responding, leading to decreased federal funding and political representation for Black and Brown communities. So if we have time later, I wanted to also put a plug in for the Census Bureau and their development of new data tools that would help the enforcement of voting rights.
Thank you so much, Tanya. It was very helpful to understand how this project is planning to politicize these critical information sharing data knowledge institutions. And you talked a little bit about how Project 2025 plans to change how people are counted in the census. I'm wondering if you could add to that and talk about the project's plan in terms of how it would handle allegations of voter fraud and how that fits into our broader landscape of the challenges that are facing Black voters.
Sure. So I'll take each question, each part separately. So first, allocation. So again, the mandate proposes command and control by increasing political appointees. So the influence of political appointees on data collection, processing, and reporting will lead to an inaccurate and incomplete census count, disproportionately affecting Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. This poses a serious threat to political representation and federal funding allocation. So states with large populations of historically undercounted groups, such as California, Texas, and New York, are at a heightened risk of losing seats in the House of Representatives. Since each congressional district represents about 700,000 people, this undercount equates to losing approximately 3 seats in the House of Representatives. So the Census Bureau has a long history of undercounting Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities while overcounting white communities, let's be honest, a disparity that will only worsen under Project 2025's proposal. So how does undercounting impact Black political participation? By shifting or moving political representation from areas with high Black populations to predominantly white areas. Therefore, undercount significantly undermines the political power of Black communities. And undercounts also affect local and state administration, redistricting, and the integrity of the Electoral College and U.S. Congress. Undercounts result in insufficient, not enough funding for infrastructure and social services, and this will have a significant financial implication for Black and Brown communities.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I appreciate you laying that out so clearly for us, the impact of Project 2025 on Black political participation. And I'd like to now turn and invite our colleague, Ariel Humphreys, LDF's Assistant Counsel, into the conversation. Good afternoon, Ariel. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm doing well. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for joining us. And I'm hoping that you could help us understand this aspect of Project 2025, which is it outlines a plan to significantly reduce access to abortion. It includes directing the FDA to revoke its approval of the abortion drug mifepristone and blocking any abortion equipment or medication from being mailed, and much, much more. So could you help us understand the health risks that are associated with being denied abortion care?
Absolutely. Well, there are serious potential health risks of being denied abortion care. Many folks may have seen the reporting about Amber Thurman's preventable death after she could not access legal abortion care in her home state of Georgia. And it was a delay in receiving the emergency medical care that she needed that contributed to her death. If Project 2025 is implemented, then there will be more pregnant people who will suffer from being denied abortion care services, including emergency abortion care. One way that this will happen is that Project 2025 states that there is no federal protection to require emergency abortion care services. This is contrary to federal law, namely the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, known as EMTALA, which is the statute that requires Medicare-funded hospitals to provide necessary stabilizing treatment for any patient with an emergency medical condition, regardless of that patient's ability to pay. And Congress amended the statute specifically to clarify and extend those protections to pregnant people. So under the federal law, EMTALA ensures meaningful access to emergency health care for everyone, including for pregnant patients who may require pregnancy termination as part of the necessary stabilizing treatment. But Project 2025, however, supports a position contrary to federal law. It states that, quote, EMTALA requires no abortions, preempts no pro-life state laws, and explicitly requires stabilization of the unborn child, end quote, as opposed to the pregnant person. So under this interpretation of EMTALA, states such as Georgia or Idaho, which recently had a Supreme Court case about this very law, would be permitted to ban abortion care even when it's necessary during a medical emergency to protect the pregnant person's health. There are many medical situations that require emergency abortion care services, including for wanted pregnancies, but Project 2025 would make abortion services more difficult to access. At the same time, being denied abortion care and continuing a pregnancy poses significant health risks, particularly for Black women. Black women are 3 times more likely to die from an issue related to pregnancy than white women due to multiple factors, but most importantly for our purposes here is to discuss the structural racism and implicit bias that contributes to these disparities. A recent study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that the highest income Black women had equally high maternal mortality rates as low-income white women. And this study demonstrated that disparities are not explained simply by income, age, marital status, or country of birth, but that structural racism plays a major role. Further, restrictions on abortion access, including restrictions on medication abortions, which you mentioned, and access to abortion in emergency situations, will likely exacerbate these problems if Black people who are especially vulnerable to pregnancy-related health conditions are unable to terminate a pregnancy. And this is already a grave risk for the 57% of Black women of reproductive age who live in 26 states, more than half of the states that have either banned or are likely to ban abortion care.
Wow, thank you so much, Ariel, for laying that out for us. And can you tell us a little bit more about how these restrictions on healthcare access will actually impact Black people's economic future as well?
Yeah, I mean, so Project 2025 will also restrict the already limited economic opportunities for Black pregnant people. The benefits of better access to reproductive health care, including abortion care, are significant. For example, Black women are likely to see a 7% increase in employment opportunities if they live in a place where abortion access is protected. Additionally, research pre-Dobbs demonstrates that the legalization of abortion led to increased rates of high school graduation, college entrance, and participation in the workforce for Black women. And Black people are more likely than white people to live in poverty for 3 consecutive generations. And because many people who seek abortion care are already parents, limiting access to abortion care can substantially increase the financial burdens on Black families and just contribute to this racial wealth gap. In addition to that, one leading study found that women who were denied a wanted abortion faced economic hardship and insecurity for years to come, including not having enough money for necessities like food and housing. And this is especially difficult for folks who live in what's known as an abortion desert, or a place where people must travel at least 100 miles to reach an abortion facility. And for those individuals, they may face additional economic barriers if they must travel out of state for abortion care. And those costs associated with travel in order to access that needed care are especially difficult for Black women who have historically faced and continue to face wage disparities and are disproportionately represented in lower paying jobs where they are less likely to have benefits such as paid sick days, which would be required in order for them to travel and recover after an abortion. And so in these ways, Project 2025's plan to restrict access to abortion care will exacerbate the existing inequities and pose dire risks for Black pregnant people's health and economic opportunities.
Thank you so much, Ariel, for laying that out for us. It's very helpful. Now I'd like to invite our colleague, Hamida Labi, who is the Senior Policy Counsel at LDF, to join us. Welcome, Hamida, and thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Keisha, and thank you all for being here today. I will speak briefly about Project 2025's education policy agenda and its potential impact on Black students and communities. First, I'd like to start out by saying that many of the proposals contained in this chapter have been championed by anti-civil rights operatives at the federal and state level long before the publication of Project 2025. We know that there are individuals who fight to cut critical federal funding for low-income students while simultaneously pushing to expand school privatization programs like vouchers, education savings accounts, and tax credit scholarships. We know that there are efforts to restrict access to higher education for students of color, whether through attacking admissions policies or through simply making college unaffordable and therefore out of reach for so many. We know that Project 2025's attack on truth and diversity, equity, and inclusion would deny Black educators and students equal access to educational opportunities. This includes efforts to eliminate access to courses like AP African American Studies, proposals that LDF has been actively fighting against in states like Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. And finally, we know what it means when opponents of racial justice refer to states' rights. And Project 2025 calls for the protection of the sovereignty of states and the need for expanded state and local control over education policy making and funding. This language harkens back to the days of the massive resistance when states vowed to defy court-ordered desegregation following the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education. It is reminiscent of Lee Atwater's Southern strategy, who admitted to using states' rights as a dog whistle intended to veil the discriminatory intent behind passing policies that would target Black Americans. Before today, I will focus on Project 2025's proposal to close the Department of Education and how it will weaken civil rights protections for the more than 7.4 million Black students enrolled in our K-12 public schools. Project 2025 calls for the abolishment of the Department of Education, the agency tasked with enforcing civil rights in education, distributing federal funding, and administering programs to address inequities in educational access. The Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, in particular, is crucial to advance policies and practices that eliminate racial disparities and strengthen state and local compliance with federal civil rights laws. This includes Title IV of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which supports school desegregation, and Title VI, which prohibits recipients of federal funds from discriminating against students based on race, color, or national origin. Project 2025 explicitly rejects the disparate impact theory of liability and cites the 2014 joint guidance from the Department of Education and Department of Justice on the non-discriminatory administration of school discipline as an example. It claims that federal overreach has pushed many school leaders to prioritize the pursuit of racial parity in school discipline over school safety. But the evidence points to a different truth. Black students continue to face severe racial disparities in school suspensions, expulsions, referrals to law enforcement, and school-based arrests. This is the case for children as young as 3 and 4 years old who are just in preschool. The most recent civil rights data collection shows that Black students were almost twice as likely to be suspended or expelled compared to their white peers based on data from the 2020-2021 school year. This is not because Black students misbehave more than their peers. It is because of the role of both explicit and implicit bias in implementing seemingly neutral school discipline policies. And disparate impact is an important tool to address these disparities, going beyond what the intent is and working to address the outcomes. Make no mistake, the longstanding efforts to eliminate the disparate impact theory of liability is an intentional effort to hamstring the federal government's ability to fulfill its legal obligation to protect students from all forms of discrimination. Project 2025's recommendation to dismantle the education department and reshuffle its oversight of its programs to states and other federal agencies will severely undermine federal efforts to provide accessible, inclusive, and high-quality public education for all students in safe learning environments that do not threaten their civil rights. Notably, this proposal comes at a time when the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights has received record high numbers of civil rights complaints. We should be discussing how to strengthen and expand the staffing and capacity of the Department of Education, an invaluable resource for Black students, educators, and parents where state and local educational agencies fail. Whether through its authority to initiate compliance reviews, investigate complaints of discrimination, monitor compliance with resolution agreements, provide technical assistance, or issuing guidance or regulations on applicable federal civil rights laws. The Department of Education's role in protecting students from racial discrimination cannot be understated. We must oppose this Project 2025 proposal and any other effort to weaken or eliminate the role of the federal government in ensuring that Black students and all students have equal access to educational opportunities.
All right. Thank you so much, Hamida. I really appreciate how well you laid out for us how the project weakens civil rights protections, critical civil rights protections for students. And now I'd like to invite Puneet Chima, LDF's manager of our Justice and Public Safety Project, into the conversation. Good afternoon, Puneet. How are you?
Isha.
Thank you for joining us. So I would like for you to talk about Project 2025's proposal as it relates to the criminal legal system. So we know that despite decades of attempted reforms, racial bias continues to exist and affect every stage of our criminal legal system. Black people are more likely than white people to be policed, arrested, charged, and harshly sentenced, including sentenced to death. These disparities are not the result of differences in participation in criminalized behavior, but rather they are the results of systematic bias. So, can you tell us how would Project 2025 impact existing racial disparities in our current criminal legal system?
Project 2025 increases the punitive nature of our criminal legal system. And because, as you mentioned, Keisha, racial biases exist at every stage of the system, it will increase the racial disparities and disproportionately harm Black people and communities. It calls for the execution, for example, of all people currently on federal death row. Although Black people make up less than 14% of the US population, they comprise 38% of people on federal death row and about 41% on state death rows. The death penalty has roots in slavery and lynchings, and racism continues to play a role in its use today. Since 1973, at least 189 people wrongly convicted and sentenced to death have been exonerated. 100 of the death row exonerees, more than half, are Black. Less than 2 weeks ago, the state of Missouri executed Marcellus Khalifa Williams, a Black man whose prosecution and conviction was marred by racial bias. The exclusion of a prospective Black juror, the state's use of unreliable witnesses, and contaminated DNA evidence all cast doubt on the integrity of his conviction. The office of the prosecuting attorney that initially convicted Mr. Marcellus objected to his execution and moved to vacate his conviction. The victim's own family wished for Mr. Williams' life to be spared, but it was not. Project 2025's enforcement of the death penalty puts at risk the lives of Black people convicted in a criminal legal system infected by racial bias at every stage. And beyond the death penalty, the project's urging of prosecutors to pursue mandatory minimum sentences for people with certain previous convictions will increase the frequency and length of Black people incarcerated and the systemic harms that follow from that incarceration. 79% of people prosecuted under 18 U.S.C. 924E, the statute highlighted by the Project 2025, are already subject to mandatory minimum sentences. Mandatory minimums have resulted in exponential growth in the number of people incarcerated and the length of incarceration without any documented improvement in public safety. Research shows that federal prosecutors are 65% more likely to charge Black defendants with mandatory minimums as compared to white defendants. And more than half of the unexplained Black-white disparities in sentencing can be explained by these prosecutors' charging decisions. Evidence also suggests that mandatory minimums make communities less safe. A 2017 study revealed that a 1% increase in the prison population was associated with a 0.28% increase in violent crime and a 0.17% increase in property crime. Project 2025 calls for an expansion of these punitive and ineffective criminal legal practices that make communities less safe.
Thank you so much, Puneet. And can you please share with us how Project 2025 will affect our ability to hold police accountable?
The project abdicates DOJ responsibility to prevent and remedy civil rights violations by state and local law enforcement agencies when they systematically violate people's fundamental rights through harmful practices like racially discriminatory policing, patterns of First Amendment violations, and systematic use of excessive force. It does so by eliminating the use of court-ordered consent decrees that aim to remedy the practices within agencies that lead to systemic unlawful officer conduct. The abandoning of these tools would make it harder for communities harmed by patterns or practices of unlawful police conduct to enact meaningful remedies that will actually end the unlawful practices and prevent them from recurring. The court enforcement of these agreements, that is a feature of consent decrees, is necessary to protect the remedies from political wins, like changes in mayoral administrations or changes in leadership within the law enforcement agencies that may grow tired of implementing reforms they or their predecessors had agreed to when they are no longer in their political interest, even though the institutional problems that lead to systemic violations of fundamental rights have not been solved. And beyond the agencies that would be immediately and directly impacted by the abdication of DOJ's responsibility to hold them accountable, beyond jurisdictions where DOJ is already investigating or implementing reforms, the decision to not pursue court enforceable agreements would send a message to law enforcement and other agencies nationwide that they are free to engage in systemic unlawful conduct, and the federal government will look the other way. Patterns of excessive force, violence against peaceful protesters, racially discriminatory policing, failures to investigate sexual assault. Regardless of the widespread nature of these violations or the egregiousness of the conduct, communities across the country will have no recourse. Black people and communities are aggressively policed and underserved, resulting in more frequent and violent interactions with police, more searches and intrusions on their persons and in their homes, leading to higher rates of arrest and incarceration. The proposals in Project 2025 will undoubtedly harm and destabilize Black communities while making us all less safe.
Wow. Thank you so much, Puneet, for sharing those important insights around what Project 2025 offers to us. Now, I would like to invite David Wheaton, LDF's Policy Counsel, into this conversation. Good afternoon, David. How are you?
Good afternoon, Keisha. It's good to be here with you talking about such an important topic.
We are glad to have you here and share your insights with us around Project 2025's plan as it relates to environmental justice. So I know that for decades, government actors have disproportionately cited hazardous facilities in communities of color, and they've also failed to invest in basic infrastructure like drinking and wastewater, which create additional health risks for Black communities. So share with us how Project 2025 would affect Black communities' exposure to and impact from environmental harms.
Yeah. So Project 2025 will dismantle federal efforts to expand Black communities' access to safe air, clean water, and climate-resilient housing. These proposals will weaken, defund, and in some cases, completely eliminate programs, regulations, and offices that strive to keep the environment safe and livable. Project 2025 will drastically weaken environmental protections that significantly reduce the size and capacity of the EPA, including eliminating EPA's Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. It would also end the ability of DOJ's Office of Environmental Justice to hold jurisdictions accountable that are not in compliance with environmental civil rights protections. Project 2025 would restrict the federal government's ability to enforce civil rights protections and would leave marginalized communities without crucial safeguards against the unequal effects of climate change and environmental hazards. So, for example, in 2023, DOJ Civil Rights Division reached a settlement with the Alabama Department of Public Health after determining that the health department discriminated against Black residents by mismanaging their sewage disposal program and denying a credible hookworm outbreak that had a devastating impact on the community. As part of that settlement agreement, Alabama agreed to suspend the enforcement of sanitation laws that could result in criminal charges against residents who could not afford septic systems. This disproportionately affected Black Alabamians. Also in 2023, the DOJ reached a settlement agreement with the city of Houston in response illegal dumping in Black neighborhoods. The investigation found that pervasive illegal dumping had negative effects on the health, safety, and quality of life for the majority of Black Houston residents living in that area. So Project 2025 proposes that the federal government pause and review all of these ongoing environmental justice investigations, voluntary resolution agreements, and consent decrees, which would delay action on similar environmental justice matters as the two examples I just named across the country, and particularly have dire consequences for Black communities. Project 2025's proposals to reduce environmental regulations and the enforcement of environmental protections will exacerbate environmental racism and cause Black communities who are already face more severe and prolonged exposure to environmental hazards to suffer more from air pollution, water contamination, and natural disasters.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing that. So now I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about climate change. And we know that climate change also poses an increasing threat to Black communities who disproportionately live in areas that are prone to extreme heat, storm damage, and wildfires. So how would Project 2025 impact our ability to fight climate change?
Yeah. So first, do just a little level setting. We know that climate change threatens essential infrastructure and access to clean air and water through extreme weather events, that have disproportionate effects on Black communities. Black families are more likely to live in regions of the country with an especially high risk of extreme weather events caused by climate change, such as flooding, hurricanes, and extreme heat. And the events of the past week, we definitely have seen how climate change and natural disasters can impact a community. So we know that majority Black neighborhoods are also more susceptible to consequences of extreme weather due to historic and ongoing disinvestment in infrastructure. So climate resilience is key for the long-term health and well-being of Black communities, which are more vulnerable given their greater vulnerability to natural disasters and climate-related weather events due to decades of disinvestment in infrastructure. Climate resiliency is therefore essential for the long-term health and well-being for Black communities. For example, in Houston, Texas, more than 80% of the city's open drainage ditches are located in low-income communities of color. Compared to wealthier neighborhoods. And so during Hurricane Harvey, the open ditches overflooded, spreading sewage into Black people's homes and flooding damage into Black neighborhoods in Houston that was actually not experienced by wider and wealthier communities. Project 2025 would halt and reverse investments into climate resilience. For example, Project 2025 supports repealing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, two groundbreaking laws that included unprecedented federal investments in water infrastructure and climate resilience. And Project 2025 calls for the rescinding of all unspent funds under those two legislations. The Inflation Reduction Act specifically created 272 new clean energy projects across the country, creating more than 170,000 new jobs for electricians, mechanics, and construction workers and others. About half of these new clean energy projects are in counties, cities, or towns with higher than average Black populations, resulting in more than $53 billion of investments in these communities, which includes the creation of more than 58,000 new jobs. Project 2025 supports the repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act to eliminate these investments in Black communities. Furthermore, Project 2025 proposes reversing investments in climate resilience and improvements in water infrastructure that aim to make Black communities healthier. Many majority Black cities are using the funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to address water infrastructure issues such as lead service line replacement. In Illinois, which has more lead pipes than any other state, and where Black and Latinx residents are twice as likely than their white counterparts to live in neighborhoods with lead service line pipes, those communities are using the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to funds to help reduce and replace those lead service lines in Black communities. Additionally, withdrawing investments from clean energy infrastructure while increasing investments in polluting fossil fuels, which Project 2025 proposes, would have a direct impact on the health of Black communities, given that Black people face the brunt of the consequences of the nation's over-reliance on fossil fuels. More than 1 million Black residents live within half a mile of a natural gas facility, and more than 6.7 live within a 9.1 radius of oil refineries.
Right. Thank you so much, David, for sharing with us just a few of the ways in which Project 2025 threatens the health and well-being of Black communities. I'd now like to invite our colleague, Amalia Smirniotopoulos, LDF Senior Policy Counsel and the co-manager of the Equal Protection Initiative, into the conversation. Good afternoon, Amalia. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here.
We are thrilled to have you. And I'm hoping that you can help us understand what you consider to be the three most important things that people should know about how Project 2025 will limit equality and dignity under the U.S. Constitution and civil rights laws.
Great. I'm happy to walk you guys through that. So I think the first thing that's important to understand is that Project 2025 would make it easier for employers, federal contractors, and other organizations to discriminate against Black people, other people of color, and other marginalized groups. Project 2025 proposes eliminating policies and practices that the federal government uses to help ensure equal opportunities for Black people. Its goal is ultimately to erase our ability to identify and address racial inequality. Among other things, Project 2025 plans to hide discrimination by preventing workforce data collection. It will do this by eliminating the ways in which the U.S. Equal Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, requires employers to report demographic data on the composition of their workforce. By ending this data collection, Project 2025 would make it harder to identify discrimination as it's happening. Project 2025 also proposes to eliminate policies that ensure equal employment opportunities. As many of you may know, the federal government is one of the nation's largest employers, and many agencies rely on policies and programs to increase diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the federal workforce. Programs like mentoring and recruiting have been shown to have a significant impact in addressing the barriers to opportunity that can stymie Black workers. But Project 2025 would dismantle those programs and prevent the federal government from creating those equal opportunities and ensuring that it can employ all of the talent that's available in this country. Project 2025 would also propose to shrink our existing civil rights protections. The unfortunate reality is that race and gender discrimination remains a persistent problem in the United States, and the EEOC receives more complaints alleging those concerns than other forms of discrimination year after year. Yet Project 2025 would direct the EEOC to reorient its enforcement priorities and limit its investigations of the most common forms of discrimination. It also proposes to entirely eliminate the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, which is the entity within the federal government that ensures that the companies that the federal government is giving taxpayer dollars to are not themselves discriminating. And finally, it would end our ability to address employment policies and practices that are neutral on their face, but have an unfair discriminatory effect, a legal theory known as disparate impact that my colleague Hamida was talking about earlier. Second, in addition to just eliminating those existing protections, Project 2025 would actually weaponize the federal government's civil rights enforcement agencies and direct them to attack state and local governments, employers, and private parties who are trying to remove barriers to opportunity in their own institutions. Instead of having the government being the entity that expands opportunity, it would be an entity that is actually targeting those companies and, in fact, public actors as well, that are trying to do their duty, both legal and moral duty, to ensure equal opportunities for Black people. Ultimately, should Project 2025 supporters succeed, Black communities will be vulnerable to abuses of power from those with the most economic and political power, particularly in the southern states where most Black people live.
Thank you so much, Amalia. And I'm wondering if you could just share a brief insight into how these policies that are called for in Project 2025 fit within the broader landscape of anti-discrimination laws and racial inequality challenges that we've seen in our kind of recent political context.
I think, unfortunately, what we've seen is that opponents of civil rights are already working to turn Project 2025 into a reality. Project 2025 proponents are already challenging demographic data collection and disparate impact liability in the courts, with the ultimate goal of ending our ability to see racial discrimination and address it through critical legal protections. We've also seen several attorneys general and other entities send letters to organizations from the American Bar Association to Fortune 500 companies threatening legal action for the actions those entities are taking to expand opportunity and ensure equal access to institutions of higher education, including law schools, to employment opportunities, and other key drivers of educational and economic freedom in this country. And finally, we've also seen federal and state legislation that would prevent employers and schools from instituting programs that create diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and help those institutions comply with civil rights laws. In the face of these attacks, we must redouble our commitment to achieving an economy where everyone can succeed and a society where thriving is the standard.
Yes. Thank you so much, Amalia. And finally, I'd like to invite our colleague, Sandhya Kajipeta, TMI senior researcher and statistician, into our conversation. Hi, Sandhya, how are you?
Hi, Keisha. It's great to be joining you for this important conversation.
Thank you. We're happy to have you here. Now, last year, we celebrated the 55th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, a landmark legislation that sought to undo decades of private and government-sponsored housing discrimination against Black people and other people of color. Please share with us the role that the federal government plays in ensuring that Black people can live in communities of their own choosing, and how Project 2025 would change that.
Sure. So, as many of you likely know, we are currently facing a housing affordability crisis. The impacts of this crisis are particularly felt by Black communities, and Project 2025 would exacerbate those harms. As Keisha said, housing in the US has been shaped by a long history of anti-Black discriminatory policies and practices. The federal government, and specifically HUD, plays a critical role in redressing the harms of discrimination and segregation to ensure that Black families can live in the homes and neighborhoods that they choose. HUD's primary strategies to improve housing access are increasing access to rental housing, increasing access to homeownership, and enforcing fair housing laws. Project 2025 would limit HUD's ability to act in each of these areas. and I'll walk through each of these areas in more detail. So first, HUD operates several rental assistance programs, the largest of which is the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is a crucial anchor providing secure homes for millions of families. Black families are disproportionately likely to rely on vouchers to access housing, as are people with disabilities. Project 2025 would dramatically shrink HUD's rental assistance programs, despite the fact that there is already an insufficient supply of vouchers to meet the overwhelming demand. Project 2025 proposes decreasing rental assistance through drastic cuts to subsidizing housing and voucher programs, adding more requirements to applications for rental assistance, and ending housing subsidies, including to low-income households who comply with all program requirements. Second, recognizing that homeownership is one of the primary ways that American families build wealth, HUD plays a role in increasing access to homeownership, especially for first-time home buyers and those from marginalized backgrounds who have historically been excluded from homeownership opportunities, including many Black families. Project 2025 would restrict access to homeownership by increasing mortgage insurance premiums, which HUD recently reduced, and decreasing down payment assistance. Decades of housing discrimination have produced a stark racial homeownership gap where Black households are significantly less likely to own their homes than white households. Efforts to weaken homeownership and equal credit opportunities for Black families will exacerbate income inequality. Finally, HUD plays a critical role in consistent enforcement of fair housing laws. Project 2025 would end HUD's ability to enforce fair housing laws by ending fair housing testing and data collection, transferring federal enforcement obligations to state and local governments. Project 2025 would also repeal the affirmatively furthering fair housing interim final rule, which spells out the obligations of state and local agencies to remedy the effects of housing discrimination. Given the anti-civil rights positions that certain states and localities have taken, both historically and in recent years, relying solely on these smaller units of government to enforce the Federal Fair Housing Act would subject Black communities across the country to housing discrimination and strip them of their civil rights under federal law.
Thanks so much, Sandhya, for explaining that to us. And now I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how Project 2025 would impact people who are currently unhoused.
Thanks for this question. So we know that Project 2025 would exacerbate homelessness, especially for Black people who already experience homelessness at higher rates than white people. Black people represent 13% of the US population, but account for 37% of people experiencing homelessness and more than 50% of unhoused families with children. First, Project 2025's tactic of dramatically cutting rental assistance programs will increase the number of people impacted by homelessness. Without these crucial programs, many families, especially Black families, will be unable to afford housing. Project 2025 will also exacerbate the affordable housing crisis by encouraging local governments to invest exclusively in single-family zoning. Single-family zoning has a long history of being racially motivated to exclude Black families from white neighborhoods. This proposal is a direct threat to Black communities, and it will further restrict housing supply. Finally, Project 2025 proposes that the federal government abandon a housing-first approach, which is an evidence-based approach to reduce homelessness and help people obtain permanent housing as quickly as possible, recognizing that having a safe home is critical to addressing mental and behavioral health problems. Project 2025 would instead require unhoused people to address any mental health and substance use issues before seeking permanent housing, which is not responsive to the realities of addiction and recovery.
All right, thank you so much, Sandhya, for explaining that to us. And thank you to all of my fellow colleagues for sharing sections of the chapters that you worked on. And now I would like to turn the mic to our president and director counsel, Janae Nelson, to share with us some remarks around the importance of paying attention to this policy proposal. Janae?
Thank you, Keisha, and thank you to all of our presenters, and especially thank you so much for joining today's briefing. We are so excited about this newly released report from our Thurgood Marshall Institute, Attack on Our Power and Dignity, What Project 2025 Means for Black Communities. Of course, we wish we did not have to write it, but now that Project 2025 has presented itself as a threat, we felt it incumbent upon us to address it. We hope that today's briefing offered a helpful overview of this compelling report. It is the most comprehensive legal analysis to date of Project 2025's potential impact on Black communities across the United States. We also hope that the report's affirmative vision for an America where Black communities can thrive can also serve as the common blueprint for the work ahead. As the nation's premier legal organization fighting for racial justice, LDF felt it important, we felt it imperative to offer a robust dissection of Project 2025 and to offer a counterpoint and a riposte to this extremist manifesto. We also wanted to give you an opportunity to hear directly from the report's authors who worked so hard on making sure that this information was available to the public and to provide you with information to use as you work with your colleagues in Congress to thwart the regressive and dangerous policy proposals that are in Project 2025. And this convening could not have come at a more important moment in our history. We know that our democracy stands at a crossroads. We're facing both a path of infinite promise towards a more inclusive and equitable and durable democracy, and also a path of immeasurable and potentially irretrievable demise. And we at LDF believe that the vision outlined in Project 2025 would almost certainly condemn us to demise. So you've heard about the many concerns that we have about Project 2025. It aims to consolidate presidential authority, dismantle essential federal agencies, to upend critical regulations and anti-discrimination protections that are not only dangerous to democracy, but also specifically to Black communities. It is a radical proposal to expand executive authority that would also jeopardize fundamental rule of law principles and disrupt the system of checks and balances. And supporters of this extremist agenda are already working to implement it not only at the federal level, but at state and local levels. And even though Project 2025 does not name Black people as the direct targets of its regressive policy proposals, as we've noted today, our research found that in practice, the proposals in Project 2025 would undermine and attack Black political power, civil rights protections, economic and educational opportunities, while promoting punitive criminal legal policies and exacerbating disparities in health and housing and many other areas. If Project 2025 is enacted, it would erode the very foundation of our democracy, and our nation would be transformed to the severe detriment of our multiracial and multi-ethnic future. But as alarming as this disturbing set of proposals may be, this extremist blueprint for democracy's demise does not need to be our destiny. As we stare down the alarming possibility of Project 2025 becoming our reality, I'm confident that those of us who respect the rule of law are the majority in this country. And we are equally committed and equipped to continue the fight for a shared future where thriving is the standard for all. So thank you to all of our presenters and authors, and thank you for joining us today in the fight for justice, equity, and democracy.
I want to join Janae in thanking all of you for joining us in this critical conversation. So as we've said, LDF continues our work to protect the rights and the dignity of Black people. We understand that these challenges posed by Project 2025 are part of a long history of efforts to undermine Black communities. And just as LDF has fought in the past and present against Jim Crow laws and racial inequality, we remain committed to standing against this new threat. And the vision of an inclusive, equal society is not just a goal, but our responsibility. So with vigilance and determination, LDF will strive to ensure that the rights that Black communities have fought for are preserved and expanded in our future generations. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.